Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rose New, Chief Conservation Officer at the Polson Institute. The Polson Institute is a nonpartisan, independent think and do tank dedicated to fostering a US-China relationship that serves to maintain global order in a rapidly evolving world. To support CBD COP15 and its preparation process, my organization initiated a research project 2 years ago in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Cornell University, and we launched our research report named Financing Nature, Closing Global Biodiversity Financing Gap in September last year. If you are interested in reading the full report, you can download it from our website. First, I'd like to share the 5 key insights of our report. Most importantly, we believe the only way to slow and stop global biodiversity loss is to ensure nature is appropriately valued in all economies and across all sectors. The global biodiversity financing gap is large, but can be closed for less than 1% of annual global GDP. A lot of attention has been on what the private sector can do or how much ODA funding can be raised in the CBD negotiations. We believe that private companies and investors have the potential to play a huge role, but the most impactful actions to unlock both public and private financial flows are through reforming policies and improving regulatory frameworks by national governments. And lastly, increasing ODA alone will not close the financing gap. We estimate annual financial flow towards biodiversity conservation is at least in the range of 124 to 143 billion US dollar per year as of 2019, which is only 0.12% to 0.14% of global annual GDP. Currently, majority of the funding comes from public sector, and domestic budget and fiscal policies of governments alone represent 54% to 60% of the total annual flows. A key finding of our research is that total annual subsidies to agriculture, fishery, and forestry, which are potentially harmful to biodiversity, is between 274 to 542 billion US dollar per year. This harmful spending is 2 to 4 times larger than current total financing flow into biodiversity conservation. Therefore, we believe reducing and redirecting those harmful subsidies are at the top of the list for action countries should take. Our research organized estimation of global biodiversity funding needs into 3 components, namely biodiversity conservation through terrestrial and marine protected areas, sustainably managing productive landscape and seascapes, and biodiversity conservation in peri-urban areas and reducing water pollution. This number, which ranges between 722 and 967 billion US dollar per year, is the basis for us to determine the annual financing gap. This graph shows the total biodiversity financing gap represented by the pink box in the center. The gap is around 700 billion US dollar per year. While this amount seems very large, it's actually comparable to the total global climate commitment of nearly 600 billion US dollar per year. For context, this amount is less than the world spends on a soft drink in a year. This slide is important as it demonstrates the biggest area of financing and policy needed to close the biodiversity financing gap. If the 7 areas shown in green color, namely biodiversity offset, natural infrastructure, green financial products, domestic budget and tax policy, nature-based solutions, and carbon market, ODA, and sustainable supply chain can be scaled up, they will produce billions of dollars in new revenue for biodiversity conservation. However, it's important to highlight that this financing gap will not be closed unless all countries take significant efforts to scale up the reform of subsidies harmful to biodiversity and improve investment risk management practices by financial sector. Shown on the slide in red color represent nearly half of the total biodiversity financing gap. In summary, closing the global biodiversity financing gap relies heavily on government policies to reform harmful subsidies, reduce investment risk by private investors, and support new financial innovations to increase capital flow towards biodiversity protection and restoration. Our report proposes a set of resource mobilization goals and targets for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In global level, parties should collectively close the financing gap by 2030 by both increasing funding from all sources and reducing harmful subsidies and investment in all sectors. International development aids, or ODA, for biodiversity should at least double by 2025 to cover the costs of developing countries to develop their national biodiversity strategy and action plans and national biodiversity finance plans. I'd like to highlight that even if doubled, ODA and donor funding cannot close even 10% of the total global financing gap. Therefore, it's very important that all parties complete their national biodiversity finance plans by 2024, and all countries raise the needed funds and establish incentive policies and regulatory framework by 2030. Now, I'd like to provide some additional details on how we can achieve the 2 global goals and 2 national targets. One key suggestion here is that Global Environment Facility, GEF, should increase the resource available for biodiversity focal area to support countries with implementation of National Biodiversity Finance Plan and prioritize funding for domestic policy and fiscal reforms rather than discrete field projects. Bilateral and multilateral donors should prioritize the capacity building for domestic policy reforms and covering sectoral transition costs. Multilateral financial institutions should provide blended investment capital, such as concessionary loans and equity, to help attract and secure private investment in nature-positive projects, and work with private banks to develop and incorporate investment risk screens and mitigation requirements to avoid harm to nature. Lastly, we believe the resource mobilization strategy must be tightly linked with the mainstreaming agenda, particularly in 3 sectors, namely agriculture, infrastructure, and financial service. Thank you for your time today.